Tangent, the male gaze. Tangent, the feminine urge to be recognized in your full subjectivity by a partner who simultaneously desires you as an object and to somehow navigate all the contradictions inherently entailed therein. So the male gaze is a piece of jargon from academic film theory and art criticism that has entered the everyday vocabulary of the woman in the street. In colloquial usage, the male gaze describes a basic trauma of feminine existence, women's everyday experience of being scrutinized, appraised, leered at, surveyed, and judged by men. The phrase was originally coined in 1972 by the art critic John Berger in his book and BBC television series Ways of Seeing.
Women constantly meet glances which act like mirrors, reminding them of how they look or how they should look. Behind every glance is a judgment.
So the concept of the male gaze is very important to feminism, but it has to be articulated carefully or things can get real stupid real fast. Especially when it comes to discussing the male gaze versus the female gaze, as if these are two essential, unitary, categorically different ways of looking at the world. There's a kind of lazy view of male gaze and female gaze that says the male gaze is when leering, perverted, voyeuristic, hypersexual, focused on body parts, ew. And the female gaze is when soft, aesthetic, innocent, chaste, pure, focused on emotions, good. The female gaze is when emotions. Congratulations, you've redescribed Victorian gender stereotypes. I don't know if this qualifies as radical feminist theory. I feel like for a theory to qualify as feminist, it has to at least advance a thesis that 19th century sexologists would disagree with. Back in the 1800s, there was a guy called
Richard von Krafft-Ebing,
who wrote a book called Psychopathia Sexualis, one of the first systematic attempts to study human sexuality. Its case studies had to be published in Latin so commoners wouldn't get any notions. Krafft-Ebing reached such groundbreaking conclusions as, quote,
"Man has beyond doubt the stronger sexual appetite of the two. Woman, however, if physically and mentally normal and properly educated, has but little sensual desire. Nevertheless, sexual consciousness is stronger in woman than in man, but her love is more spiritual than sensual."
This was a basic idea of 19th century sexology, of early psychoanalysis. Men are driven by sex. Women are emotional, and who knows what they want. But sometimes I feel like the last century or so hasn't really made that much progress on this. I just read an academic feminist article on the movie The Devil Wears Prada, which argued that this movie is female gaze because women like to look at clothes. Did we really need 100 years of feminist research to discover that men like boobs and women like clothes?
Groundbreaking.
I'm not even saying that it's wrong. Like, most men do like boobs and lots of women do like to look at clothes. But this observation is just a little obvious for my taste. I always thought The Devil Wears Prada was female gaze for different reasons. Don't you just want Miranda Priestley to step on your cerulean sweater? I hope I don't need to argue that men can write mushy romance and women can be leering perverts. With gender and sexuality, every generalization is an overgeneralization. So what are we even talking about here? I do think there's utility in talking about the male gaze, so what is the male gaze? Well, it's not just taking sexual pleasure in looking, what Freud called scopophilia, pleasure in looking.
It is usual for most normal people to linger to some extent on the intermediate sexual aim of a looking that has a sexual tinge to it. Indeed, this offers them a possibility of directing some proportion of their libido onto higher artistic aims.
It's hot, I'm taking this sweater off. I feel like the worst, most reductive understanding of the male gaze that I want to avoid is the idea that the male gaze is when a man looks at a woman with lust in his heart. It can't just be that. So what is it? What are we talking about? A male behavioral pattern? A style of visual representation in art, in cinema, in pornography, in advertising? Is the male gaze an essential fact inherent to masculine sexuality? Or is it a sociological phenomenon? Well, when we talk about the male gaze, a lot of what we're talking about is the way that sexual gazing intersects with power. There's power in gazing and vulnerability in being gazed at. Like in the 2000 comedy Anchorman, The Legend of Ron Burgundy, where Ron Burgundy envisions a perfect patriarchal household where he prohibits his children from making eye contact.
No eye contact!
I think this scene is actually only in the extended edition, so now I have to live with the fact that I've somehow watched the director's cut of Anchorman, The Legend of Ron Burgundy. The patriarch gazes at his children, but the children are not allowed to gaze in return. Lowered eyes are a sign of submission. Feminist Bell Hooks writes in her essay, The Oppositional Gaze, Black Female Spectators,
When thinking about black female spectators, I remember being punished as a child for staring, for those hard, intense, direct looks children would give grown-ups, looks that were seen as confrontational, as gestures of resistance, challenges to authority. The gaze has always been political in my life. There is power in looking.
She describes how enslaved people were often punished for looking at their enslavers. John Berger points out that in European oil paintings, men are clothed while women are nude. This reflects a situation of power. It's humiliating to be seen without being able to see, like the sexual aggressor Frank in David Lynch's film Blue Velvet, who commands Dorothy not to look at him while he's assaulting her.
Don't you fucking look at me.
Women, children, enslaved people, those without power are denied a gaze of their own. In the case of enslavers, it's obvious to me that the reason that they punish the gaze of enslaved people is that there's shame and guilt in being seen. To stave off the feeling of guilt, the aggressor has to deny his victim's viewpoint. Something similar to that was said by a French philosopher called Sartre, who started a little thing called existentialism that you may have heard of. According to Sartre, we actually discover ourselves, our own ego, through the experience of being seen by other people. He uses a revealing example of a peeping Tom who has no consciousness of himself as he looks through a keyhole, but who suddenly experiences shame and self-consciousness, not just when he's seen, but when he becomes aware that he could be seen. Being gazed at forces the experience of self-awareness on us, which is maybe inherently an experience of shame. Cringe. It's what Barbie experiences when she's leered at for the first time.
I feel kind of ill at ease, like I'm conscious, but it's myself that I'm conscious of.
Before I dig too much deeper into this, I should probably address that many men object to the entire concept of the male gaze, claiming that their sexual desire is inherently visual and that feminists complaining about the male gaze are castrators who are persecuting male sexuality.
Yeah, my sexuality does not become a crime simply because I am a straight, white male who likes hot ladies. And frankly, Anita, we can live without your own brand of cyber Sharia.
I think this conflict arises because men often feel enslaved by their own desire for women, and women feel enslaved by men's desire. I don't think this is a valid objection because, one, the male struggle against what the church fathers called concupiscence is not an oppression inflicted on men by women. And two, a steelman version of the feminist critique of male gaze is not an attack on visual pleasure itself, but on the way that it's used to dehumanize women in everyday life. I want to be clearer on this point than many feminists are. I think that visual pleasure is as natural a component of human sexuality as the pleasure of skin-to-skin touch.
Don't you feel eyes moving over your body, Clarice? And don't your eyes seek out the things you want?
I do not think we should eliminate male visual pleasure, nor could we even if we wanted to. I also reject the essentialist idea that female sexuality isn't visual, but I know I'm going against the popular wisdom here, which says that male sexuality is visual and female sexuality isn't. This idea is so prevalent that before we get into any kind of more theoretical discussion, I feel like I have to address it. Part 1. Alleged psychosexual dimorphism. I don't believe in anatomical destiny. I am a trans person, so that wouldn't really make any sense. But I do believe in sociological tendency. I think it would be fair to say that men have a tendency to look at women, and to artistically represent women in ways that many women find uncomfortable and traumatizing. Now, there's a common sense belief that there is something called male sexuality, which is fundamentally different from another thing called female sexuality. People believe this for understandable reasons. At a population level, men and women express sexuality very differently. And yes, hormones and other biological factors probably have something to do with it, but I think that talk of an organic male sexuality versus female sexuality is probably not justified, for reasons that I will explain. That said, comparing and contrasting the sexuality of men and women seems almost inescapable. The stereotypical view of the difference is well captured in an episode of the show Tuca and Birdie, in which the heterosexual bird couple, Birdie and Speckle, decide to spice up their sex life by showing each other what kind of pornography they consume. So Speckle shows Birdie a stereotypical X-Hub type video with a corny plot where the pizza man turns out to be the girl's boyfriend and then they immediately fuck on the couch. And then Birdie, the girl bird, shows Speckle The Nests of Netherfield, a Jane Austen or Regency romance parody.
I've longed for this moment through 15 long winters and one surprisingly short spring.
Then we shan't waste a moment more.
And Speckle and Birdie are unable to understand what the other finds hot about the thing they like without a lot of explanation.
You want me to ignore you for 15 years, then give you a small peck on the beak?
No! It's not about the peck. It's about the building of desire, the longing, the passion.
I guess this is an experience that a lot of heterosexual couples have. The tension arises out of the fact that men's sexuality is often expressed as visual, physical, and emotionally detached, whereas women's sexuality is stereotypically narrative, spiritual, and requires emotional investment. The usual dynamic is that men are bored by the things women like, which they find incomprehensible, and women are creeped out by the things men like, which they find gross. The underlying assumption is something like male sexuality is simple gratification of an animal instinct, whereas female sexuality is literary. Pleasure has to mean something. Slavoj Žižek says that women preemptively narrativize sexual encounters.
The true enjoyment is not in doing it, but in telling about it afterwards.
And there is a long-standing tendency of women to prefer written erotica to visual pornography. This has resulted in a lot of feminists basically ceding visual sexuality to men. Sexual interest in looking at anything above the ankle is the male gaze, and sexual interest in looking at anything below the ankle is definitely the male gaze. And men's leering, awkward, unself-conscious, guiltless sexual hyperfixations certainly are everywhere in media. A lot of the most popular anime series like Evangelion, I actually find basically unwatchable because of this. Just the constant, gratuitous creep shots of underage girls. I guess you could argue it's really important to Shinji's character or whatever that we all share his gaze. Still not gonna recommend this show to a woman though. There's any number of examples I could point to of men on the internet having insanely delusional, introverted ideas about what women's bodies look like.
AI art bots have already perfected the female form. I think psychoanalysis is a dysfunctional German field that provides little explanatory power.
I doubt the male gaze would bother women as much as it does if so many men didn't allow sexual fantasy to overtake their sense of reality. It's embarrassing. It makes you seem like you've never interacted with a woman in real life. So it's gonna be hard for me to defend men against this stereotype, but I will defend men from the accusation that their sexuality is merely animalistic or extremely simple. Look at this boomer meme suggesting that women's sexuality is really complicated and men's sexuality is an on-off switch. Is male sexuality really simple? I mean, men are the ones who are capable of substituting a woman's foot for the entire sexual object. Is that simple? Is that not mysterious? And on the other hand, when women read romance and erotica, don't you see in your mind's eye what's happening? Isn't that a kind of visual sexuality?
Edward in the sunlight was shocking. I couldn't get used to it, though I'd been staring at him all afternoon. His skin, white despite the faint flush from yesterday's hunting trip, literally sparkled, like thousands of tiny diamonds were embedded in the surface.
This is a very opulent visual description, considering that women's sexuality is not visual. I feel like there's 3 common theories of female sexuality that I've noticed floating around. The first theory we could call the phallocentric. The idea is that female sexuality is basically complementary to male sexuality, the female glove that fits the male hand. Male sadism, voyeurism, and dominance correspond conveniently to female masochism, exhibitionism, and submission. According to this basically reactionary anti-feminist view, women desire nothing more than to supply what men demand. Theory 2 I'll call the Neo-Victorian theory. The idea is that female sexuality is spiritual. It's narrative, not visual. It's slow to accelerate, based on yearning, soft, pure, and chaste, ooh. The fundamental attachment is to emotions, not to bodies. Ew. Theory 3 I'll call the female eunuch theory. This theory basically says that female sexuality as we know it is just a more repressed version of male sexuality. There's no fundamental difference between male and female sexuality on this view, except that the same instincts are expressed differently because of different socialization. This view basically assumes that masculine sexuality is the default and is superior. Germaine Greer argues that patriarchy has made women into castrated men, and suggests that women should abandon romance novels for hardcore pornography and learn to enjoy the visual pleasures of leering at young boys. Obviously, each of these theories is problematic, though they could each be defended to some extent. And the first 2 you could interpret either as anatomically destined or as socially constructed. I guess my take is that libido is, of course, an organic drive. Humans are mammals. We have a sex drive just like other mammals have. But human laws and norms are internalized as guilt and shame, which psychologically determine the form that desire takes. Because men and women are subject to different pressures and norms of masculinity and femininity, guilt and shame shape male and female desires very differently. And I think that is most of the reason for the huge differences we see between the sexes. And later in this tangent, I'll argue that that accounts for why male and female sexual desire manifests so differently. So that being said, let's look at how male desire manifests. Part 2. The Male Gaze According to Laura Mulvey. Laura Mulvey's 1975 paper, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, is the foundational text of male gaze studies. Mulvey's theory is not about how men look at women in general, it's specifically about the language of cinema and how men represent women in movies, specifically mainstream Hollywood movies. Mulvey claims there are
2 contradictory aspects of the pleasurable structures of looking in the conventional cinematic situation. The first, scopophilic, arises from pleasure in using another person as an object of sexual stimulation through sight. The second, developed through narcissism and the constitution of the ego, comes from identification with the image seen. The first is a function of the sexual instincts, the second of ego libido.
So to translate that from the psychoanalytic jargon, there's 2 components to male gaze. One is the attraction to objectified women, and the other is identification with idealized men. The first is based on object-oriented sexual attraction, and the second is based on a kind of mirror narcissism, a pleasure that men get from seeing their ideal selves reflected back at them. Now, most people who talk about the male gaze focus on the first aspect, the objectification aspect. Women in movies suspend the narrative flow and are enjoyed as objects of the gaze. As objects of desire, they motivate the protagonist. The camera cuts women's bodies into pieces for piecemeal consumption by male characters, male viewers, and the camera, which is symbolically an eye, which is symbolically a phallus, and so on. All that psychoanalytic feminist stuff. According to Mulvey, through the visual language of cinema, women are coded as to be looked at. Shiny objects that the camera dwells on because it's just nice to look at them. I feel like most of us probably understand this concept. I don't need to elaborate on this too much. The other aspect I think is a little bit more difficult to understand, this idea of identification with the male protagonist as an ego ideal. If you take out the jargon, it's really not that difficult to understand. It's kind of like the feminist equivalent of men complaining that media created by women has Mary Sue protagonists, right? These kind of idealized self-insert fantasy protagonists that men viewing movies want to be.
A male movie star's glamorous characteristics are thus not those of the erotic object of the gaze, but those of the more perfect, more complete, more powerful ideal ego, conceived in the original moment of recognition in front of the mirror.
This is a reference to the psychoanalyst Lacan. We'll get to that. The idea is that for men, there's a narcissistic pleasure of identifying with the image of their ideal self. James Bond, superheroes. And I feel like recently male identification with movie protagonists has gotten weirder. The Joker, Patrick Bateman. So we have these two pleasures of the male gaze: scopophilic looking at the objectified woman and narcissistic identification with the idealized man. Obviously, this all assumes that the audience is male. In her follow-up essay, Mulvey addresses the question about women viewers of Hollywood movies, and she claims that women identify with the masculine spectator position too, and enjoy movies vicariously as sort of honorary men as long as they're in the theater.
For women, from childhood onwards, transsex identification is a habit that very easily becomes second nature. However, this nature does not sit easily and shifts restlessly in its borrowed transvestite clothes.
If, on the other hand, women reject male identification, then they view movies in a disenchanted, skeptical way where they can't enjoy it as fantasy. This is what Bell Hooks calls the oppositional gaze, a kind of refusal to enter into the male fantasy or to the white woman's fantasy. This is the basic stance of critiquers, right? Because they're not able to enjoy this art, they complain about it. To people who enjoy movies, this is usually annoying, but I think we can sympathize with it at least a little bit. It's hard when nothing in the mainstream culture is for you. I also want to flag that Mulvey's male gaze theory makes a lot of heterosexual assumptions, and assumed heterosexuality is a major problem with the entire discourse around male and female gaze, which is not to say that Mulvey is wrong, just that once you start talking about how queer people experience media, the whole theory sort of becomes incoherent. We'll come back to that later. I think I really will come back to that later. It's like 6 in the morning. I think I want to go to sleep and just film the rest of this tomorrow. Part 3, Objectification. It's a new section, it's a new day. I'm getting started at a crisp and bright 11 p.m. So, objectification. Objectification, I'm sorry to say, is probably fundamental to human sexuality. Most people are on some level attracted to bodies. So again, this is an area where feminist critique needs to be precise, because condemning all sexual objectification leads to zany conclusions which actually predate feminism. Maidenless German philosopher Immanuel Kant writes that masturbation makes the human agent an object of enjoyment and is therefore self-abuse and morally worse than suicide. I think this is taking things too far. Probably it's okay to sometimes use yourself as a little bit of an object. We can have a little objectification as a treat. But the feminists are right that we don't want too much objectification either. I feel like the term objectification is not really specific enough for most feminist purposes, because it's the nature of human existence that we all exist as both subjects and as objects, and sexuality, therefore, attaches to both subjective and objective agents of people, to bodies and to minds. As I see it, it's not really objectification in itself that's the problem, but rather desubjectification, dehumanization. What feminists like Anita Sarkeesian are complaining about when they talk about objectification might better be termed dehumanization. Right, this is what Martha Nussbaum's criteria of objectification are pointing towards. Instrumentality, commodification, interchangeability, violability, disposability. It's not just that someone is an object of perception for you, it's that they are a violable, thing-like, non-human object. I see objectification as kind of psychologically opposed to identification. When we objectify someone, we're refusing to identify with them. Why do men objectify women? Well, misogyny, yes, but let's be more specific. In part, I think it's because most men don't identify with women. They don't even know how to. Men are not socialized to identify with women. Boys often fear identification with girls or identification with their own mother. It's as if the boys are afraid that by identifying with girls, they might themselves become girls. I guess in my case, that is what happened. Well, the phenomenon of men writing women illustrates what happens when men who can't identify with women attempt to write female characters. Instead of plausible female identification, you get mere erotic projection. She breasted boobily. A lot of men don't know how to write women as subjects, so they write them as objects. And this is really upsetting to most women. Women are not man-haters by nature. Most women crave recognition from men, and they're disturbed that so many men seem to relate to them in this introverted, objectifying way. I also think that heterosexual men have a selfish, sexual motive for refusing to identify with women. And when I say that guilt and shame shape desire, this is part of what I'm talking about. Many people in general who are attracted to women unconsciously view women as easily hurt, easily offended. We're guilty about desiring women because we unconsciously view women as weak and vulnerable. And so we feel that being attracted to women is predatory. And I think this is a problem for straight men and for gay women, but gay women don't usually solve this problem with objectification because gay women usually find it easy to identify with other women. We see ourselves in other women, so we can't view them merely as objects. But because men often don't identify with women, objectification is a solution to the problem of guilt. Because negating the other's subjectivity eliminates the shame of being seen. When you objectify a woman, she becomes meat. You can stare and lust and consume her without the guilt and shame and self-consciousness that would result from seeing her as an equal subject. And that's why we have sex dolls. It's why we have cyborgs, robotic women, AI big titty anime GFs. A lot of men gravitate towards these objects of guiltless, introverted sexual consumption that make women really uncomfortable. Because women don't like being seen this way. Women want to be recognized as people. They don't want to be reduced to slabs of meat. Granted, some women learn to profit by pandering to this type of gazing.
Ice cream, yum!
Kitty paws purr. No, it's spicy. All of this, of course, raises the question, why do gay men objectify? I think part of it is that objectification isn't so often the trauma for gay men that it is for women. So gay men tend not to have quite the same complex, ambivalent relationship to objectification that women do. I also think that because masculinity is associated with power, objectification of men has different implications than objectification of women. In particular, a muscular man's body is not passive, soft flesh to be preyed upon. A muscular male body is power. And you see this in the almost quasi-religious attitude to male bodies that's part of gay male culture. I would even argue that gay men's objectification of men is extremely threatening to heteronormativity. It's the to-be-looked-atness of men at pride parades that is so scandalous to straight people. It's threatening to the male voyeur, female exhibitionist, heterosexual dyad. But that's not to say that objectifying men is inherently unproblematic. Regardless of whether men or women's bodies are the object, objectification taken to its extreme is predation. Part 3.5, Jeffrey Dahmer. I see Jeffrey Dahmer's cannibalistic lust murders as an extreme case of sexual objectification. If you take the logic of consuming, dominating, objectifying masculine sexuality to its extreme, you get serial killers. Before Jeff Dahmer became the cannibalistic psycho we all know and love, he stole a male mannequin from a department store. This man wanted to create sex zombies, perfect, obedient, submissive, totally possessed by him. I take as a serious challenge to us gender anti-essentialists the question, why is there no female Jeffrey Dahmer? It's not that women are angels or that women are inherently non-violent, because we know that's not true. There's women domestic abusers, there's women serial killers, but female serial killers seem to kill for different motives. It's revenge or profit. It's not pure dominating lust. Some feminists would argue that lust killing has to do with the relationship of masculinity to sexual dominance. Women's identity as women isn't actualized through sexual conquest in the way that men's identity as men is. I think this explanation makes sense when it comes to killers like Ted Bundy, who is clearly a misogynist. His killing is an extreme overextension of the social value of male sexual dominance. But how do we explain gay lust killers? How do we explain Jeffrey Dahmer? I chose him as an example for a reason. So far as I am aware, no lesbian in recorded history has ever had a refrigerator full of severed women's heads. I feel like it's related to a broader trend of sexual dimorphism when it comes to fetishism. In common usage, the word fetish is way overused. People basically use the word fetish to mean any kind of non-procreative sexual preference whatsoever. But I think the word fetish should be relegated to its more specific Freudian usage. The idea of sexual fetishism was originally introduced by analogy to religious fetishism, the idea that certain objects represent or are inhabited by gods. Likewise, fetishism is the investment of libido in specific objects. Freud calls it partialism, where a part of the sexual object stands in for the whole. So we have usually male fetishes for things like feet and shoes. I consider this one of the great mysteries of human sexuality. None of the proposed theories are all that convincing to me. Freud says that the fetish object is meant to kind of relieve castration anxiety in men, the idea being that men's sexuality sort of fixates on an object that they were aware of before they became cognizant of the mother's lack of a phallus. Some neuroscientists have suggested that on the sensory motor cortex, the part of the brain that receives input from nerves in the feet is close to that which receives input from the genitals, and so foot fetishes result from that. I don't find either of these explanations very plausible, but I feel like Freud's explanation can be translated into a more plausible version of itself. It's not that men literally fixate on a thing they saw before they saw the mother's pubic hair or whatever. Rather, it's that what Freud is calling castration anxiety is really men's fear of female subjectivity. It's their fear of the guilt and shame that comes with being seen by the woman. So reducing the woman to an object, to a shoe, to a foot, there's no anxiety or guilt associated with wanting to consume a shoe, because a shoe is not a subjective being that can subject you to its own gaze. And so you don't have to deal with the ordeal of being seen when your sexuality is fixated on a goddamn shoe. It is primarily men that do this. There are women who are especially attracted to certain parts of the body, usually hands or forearms, but this generally doesn't become a fetishistic obsession that overtakes attraction to the entire person. There's a horror movie from 2002 called May about a girl who kind of violently enacts the dynamic of male fetishism. She's only attracted to parts of people, but never the whole.
So many pretty parts, no pretty holes.
And so she goes on a slasher killer rampage and sews up a perfect body out of the parts of various people. This is a kind of fun premise for a horror movie, and it subverts the usual gender dynamic of fetishism. But I'm struggling to find any actual example of real women who act like this. Why don't women fetishize the way men do? Like I said, to me, it's still one of those great mysteries. I think about it every night as I'm lying awake in bed, thinking about stitching up the perfect human doll. Part 4. Subjectification. Part 5. The female gaze. There is no consensus on what the female gaze is, or even on whether the female gaze is a valid concept. Zoe Agapitou argues in an article on the internet I found, one solution to the question of the female gaze is that it does not and cannot exist because such a gaze would require the existence of a female-dominant culture in order to be theorized. My face when no matriarchy. Do women have a gaze? Do women have eyes? Can women see? No. The objection to the concept of the female gaze is that The idea of the male gaze is intertwined with patriarchal power, so there could not be a corresponding female gaze unless there were a corresponding female dominant power structure for it to be embedded in. This viewpoint seems to be a minority opinion though, since discourse about the female gaze, at least on social media, only seems to increase every month. One idea about the female gaze is that it's simply the negation of the male gaze. Anita Sarkeesian is a feminist critic who often implicitly seems to think this way. Instead of unrealistic, sexy male fantasy armor, female characters should have normal, practical armor that doesn't turn men on. Instead of sexy male fantasy unlockable costumes, female characters should have unlockable costumes that aren't sexualized.
And if you must go the bunny girl or cat girl route, this right here is definitely the way to do it.
Anita does a lot of theorizing that could basically be summarized as she just wants games that are made by women and that cater to women's sensibilities, and that don't cater to salivating male sexual hyperfixations. But I think this idea of the female gaze as simply not the male gaze is a little unsatisfying because a lot of people like the idea that women have a sexual gaze of their own. However, mainstream attempts to cater to a hypothetical female gaze have tended not to succeed. In the 20th century, Playgirl magazine was never as popular as Playboy, except among gay men. When Magic Mike came out in 2012, everyone said this was going to usher in a new age of female sexual gazing at men's bodies in movies. But I feel like that hasn't really happened. And I think there's a lot of reasons why that is. I mean, one reason is that our culture still treats female desire like a joke, like it's inherently hilarious that a woman would be attracted to men, which I think has a shaming and inhibiting effect on the psychology of women. I also think it's worth noting that Magic Mike has a male director, male cinematographer, and male writer, so the notion that it's deeply informed by women's desires, we could call that into question. I actually once went to a Magic Mike live show at a bachelorette party in Vegas during a very different stage of my life. And the one thing about it that really stands out to me still is just the lengths the male strippers had to go to persuade the female audience that they have permission to enjoy. The level of guilt and repression that binds the average straight woman is a force that's hard to contend with. My experience is also that in practice, male striptease is very different from female striptease. Male striptease, embodied by Magic Mike, it's not about the gradual exposure of soft, vulnerable flesh. The emphasis is all about muscles, thrusting, phallic power. There's maybe a little bit of a feminine subversive element in the shaved legs, the thongs, the twerking, but so often it relies on tropes of working class masculinity, uniforms and stock characters, cowboys, soldiers, sailors, cops, firemen, Tarzan. It's all derived from the village people, the gay men's ideas from the 1970s. Just so much thrusting. I think that gay men remain more likely to worship this kind of hard, physical masculinity. Of course, that's a generalization, like everything I'm saying in this tangent. Obviously, some women like muscles. Dear Marvel, I just saw your issue of Marvel Swimsuit Special 1994. It was very cool because it was 50-50 male-female. For once, someone was fair. It's usually 98% female. I'm a black female, late 20s. I want to see Thor nude. The Dan Panosian's Tom Smith picture didn't do him justice. In fact, 60% of all Thor pictures don't do him justice. Thor is truly a godsend. Please draw him much more handsome and nude in next year's issue. Thank you. Address withheld by request. There should honestly be a national holiday named after the woman who wrote this, but I still feel like she's the exception. Gay gym bros are all over Instagram, but there's not a lot of Tumblr girlies blogging about muscle worship.
I used to have a lot of pride in my prowess of understanding women, but I realized that I am probably really off. In my pursuit of writing a chick flick, I have written a story about men doing manly shit. I tried to include things that women would be attracted to. Policemen and firefighters saving the day. Sweaty buff military dudes doing brave shit downrange while smelling like testosterone. Guns and fast cars. Muscular dudes deadlifting iron weights and women, and sometimes each other. Women being swept off their feet by rough, calloused hands, literally. Ripped sailors manning the harpoon and then returning to shore where they get into bar fights. Henry Rollins. Scenes in the men's locker rooms and descriptions of showers where water runs down naked, muscular bodies. Chest hair. I even have one scene where a dude is listening to a woman talk about her feelings, to show dudes having a sensitive, articulate side, while being able to kick ass at the same time. I think women like that. Anyway, my audience demographic didn't turn out as expected. My story became popular among dudes, especially in the 14-25 age range. Maybe like 5% is woman. Where did I go wrong?
You fucked up my N-word. Where are the twinks? Bitches love twinks.
Bitches do love twinks. I feel like this is one of the big under-recognized facts of human sexuality. Straight women love twinks. Timothée Chalamet, K-pop idols, Edward Cullen, Beatlemania.
Gorgeous! He's gorgeous! Ringo has a sexy nose!
I know they're not technically twinks, but you know what I mean. Most straight women like men who have something feminine in them, something that women can identify with. Conventional wisdom has it that gay men love men who have something of the feminine in them, and sometimes that's definitely true, but honestly I feel like gay men are more likely to desire the masculine ideal than straight women are. A lot of gay men are gay because they love masculinity, whereas a lot of women find like rough, hard masculinity kind of like difficult to identify with, difficult to interact with. Like I honestly think that like the number one fact that debunks all incel theory is that straight women are not obsessed with chiseled jawlines. Straight women are attracted to like the most weird, idiosyncratic looking men. Look at the whole Tumblr sexy man phenomenon. Speaking of Tumblr, there's another idea of what the female gaze is that says that it's about the yearning. So maybe the archetypal example would be the Darcy hand flex from the 2005 Pride and Prejudice movie.
Mr. Darcy?
Miss Elizabeth?
Desire, tension, yearning. There's no question that in practice, this is the female gaze. Women love to yearn, but at the same time, I feel uneasy about limiting feminine fantasy to the exaggerated modesty of hand grazing. Men fuck, women make love.
I don't make love. I fuck. Hard.
Maybe not even make love. Women graze hands. Women are roommates. Isn't this neo-Victorian? Like the male gaze is this raw, animal, goggle-eyed lusting, but the female gaze is a miserable lesbian in historical costume on a rocky beach looking out at the ice-cold sea and contemplating death. I mean, relatable. I guess, if you give women permission to objectify, they'll often mention that they're attracted to such body parts as hands and forearms, which I'm sorry to be all psychoanalytic about it, but these are obvious phallic symbols. The veinier, the better. I think probably too bold a thesis on the female gaze is Germaine Greer's The Beautiful Boy, in which she argues that women should cultivate attraction to, you know, underage kids. That has not aged well, and that is not a text for the 21st century. Here's a question for the comments section. How different are straight women's desires from gay men's? I guess my thesis here is that a lot of the difference can be attributed to women's uneasy relationship with visual sexuality in general. Modesty norms, slut-shaming, fears that men will interpret women's expression of any kind of desire at all as an invitation for degrading and violent sex. I think for a lot of women, visual erotic media is also associated with putting on a show for men, performing sexuality instead of actually experiencing it. And I think that's one reason why a lot of women prefer written erotica. Most erotica is written for women, whereas most visual pornography is produced for men. That fact alone probably explains some portion of the trend. And there's also just this social pressure to be feminine, where femininity often implies passivity. Women aren't supposed to desire men. They're supposed to desire men's desire, which leads us to part 6. Feminine narcissism. Sexologists have long been suggesting some version of the idea that women's sexuality is inherently narcissistic. In trans women, it's called autogynephilia. In cis women, it's called feminine narcissism, but it's basically the same idea. Most women are pretty hostile to the idea of feminine narcissism because it's usually used to disparage women and to reinforce pre-existing stereotypes of cis women as self-absorbed bimbos or of trans women as dangerous predators, which conclusion just reinforces everyone's assumptions about us in the first place. But if we can detach it from the annoying political debates, I think we have to take this idea at least a little bit seriously, because it's not just male sexologists who have suggested it. What do you make of this viral tweet?
Men think women wear sexy outfits to the gym for the male gaze, but in reality this is only a fraction of the explanation, the primary being that female pleasure is inherently narcissistic, and we like to watch ourselves looking hot.
Who is liking this tweet? Is it only misogynistic men, or is there something about this that a lot of women relate to?
Do men even like lingerie?
We like how it makes women feel.
It's not for them.
They like how much we like it.
Women don't wear lingerie for men. I wear it so I can be wearing anything, anywhere, and secretly know that I am strapped up like a finely tuned machine, a bomb disguised as an uncomfortable present, an expensive hidden thing.
Remember that in Laura Mulvey's analysis, part of the male gaze involves narcissism too, the narcissism of identification with an ideal male ego. I do think that feminine narcissism is different. It's rooted in the heterosexual assumption that men are subjects and women are objects. This idea of a woman gazing at herself goes back to the beginning of theorizing about the male gaze. John Berger writes,
"Men look at women. Women watch themselves being looked at. This determines not only most relations between men and women, but also the relation of women to themselves. The surveyor of woman in herself is male, the surveyed female. Thus she turns herself into an object, and most particularly, an object of vision, a sight."
There's a famous quotation from Margaret Atwood's novel The Robber Bride that goes,
Male fantasies. Is everything run by male fantasies? Up on a pedestal or down on your knees? It's all a male fantasy, that you're strong enough to take what they dish out, or else too weak to do anything about it. Even pretending you aren't catering to male fantasies is a male fantasy. Pretending you're unseen, pretending you have a life of your own, that you can wash your feet and comb your hair unconscious of the ever-present watcher peering through the keyhole in your own head, if nowhere else. You are a woman with a man inside watching a woman. You are your own voyeur.
Simone de Beauvoir says in The Second Sex, to feel like a woman is to feel like a desirable object, to believe oneself desired and loved. Feminine narcissism generally involves an identification with an external, usually male spectator. There's an ongoing debate about the nature of feminine narcissism, where one side says that it's really just pandering to an external male gaze and has nothing to do with the woman's own pleasure at all. And another side says that actually, women do derive a kind of genuine pleasure from this sort of narcissistic gazing. Look at Britney Spears' Instagram feed. This constant exhibitionism. Who is this for? Honestly, I don't think that this is for men. I think that it's for her. In fact, you know it's for her because men are really threatened by Britney's Instagram account. People act like she's gone crazy. The opposing argument is expressed in this Tumblr post.
My ultimate pet peeve is women sexualizing themselves being defended as she's embracing her sexuality. It could not be more removed from her sexuality. Her sexuality is what she finds attractive. Making yourself more attractive to men is embracing men's sexuality.
So the question is this just internalized male gaze, or is it authentic female self-love? Isn't part of the reason that men feel threatened by feminine narcissism that there's something enviably autonomous about a woman desiring herself? But which self is it that does the desiring? Is it her, or is it the male voyeur in her head? You see this debate a lot around music videos, like Cardi B's video for WAP. Some feminists say this has nothing to do with female sexuality and is mere pandering to the tastes of men. Others see it as an expression of an authentic female sexuality in its own right. Don't women derive some kind of pleasure from inviting, actively soliciting male attraction? Some feminists seem to assume that female sexuality should be totally autonomous from men, or that female sexuality ought to be tender, soft, diffuse, emotional, not exhibitionistic, not sadomasochistic, not phallic, not visual, delicate, ladylike sexuality, without all that icky masculine pervert stuff. I think that most women want to be desired by men, but they don't want to know the details of male desire. The male gaze in all its horrifying details creeps women out. Consider, for example, the famous cartoonist R. Crumb, whose introverted corporeal obsessions with women appeal to a lot of men, but almost are universally disliked by women. This is not how women want to be seen. I guess there's a moral question too. Should we condemn men for seeing women in this way? I'm actually not sure that we should. I can't say that I like the way that R. Crumb depicts women, but at the same time, I find something almost touching in his honesty. He's not trying to impress or seduce women, he's just like blurting out in visual form his own abject desire. There's just no a priori reason to think that male desire should correspond to female desire. Straight people want to think that's true, but often it just isn't. Some kind of compromise has to be reached. Women want men to desire them, but sometimes you have to invent a fantasy man because he's the only one who will see you the way you want to be seen. In my opinion, the absolutely perfect feminine narcissist fantasy is the draw me like your French girl scene from James Cameron's Titanic. Leo paints Rose nude, but it's all Rose's idea, she's in control, and Leo is this adoring soft boy who just kind of sits there and trembles with the force of his yearning. It was the most erotic moment of my life.
It was the most erotic moment of my life.
Part 7. The Lesbian Gaze. Like straight women, I think most gay women have an ambivalent relationship to sexual gazing. For example, if you browse lesbian forums, you'll see a lot of posts like this.
Feel like a bad feminist for having explicit gay thoughts. I see a woman and I'm like, damn. And then I have gay thoughts and then I'm like, she's not an object stop. And then I'm like, I am gay. This is how my brain works. And the cycle continues.
As a feminist, I am appalled by these images, and as a lesbian, I am delighted.
Being attracted to women isn't objectification. That said, I'm trying to learn that too because it's gotten to the point where I'm having to teach myself that it's okay to look at my wife's boobs. My wife, who I married. Internalized homophobia is a hell of a drug.
Yeah, been there. Be respectful and don't look at her butt when she changes or bends over. You've only been together for years.
There's this feeling that frequently comes up that sexual attraction to women is inherently in conflict with feminism and with respect for women. These women feel that sexual gazing is inherently predatory and unfeminine. Like there's this dichotomy between looking respectfully and gazing at a woman with lust in your heart. Is there something inherently degrading or dominating or disrespectful about sexual gazing? Well, I don't think so. It's all a question of context, right? You looking at your wife with lust in your heart when she wants you to be attracted to her is not dehumanizing, nor is it immoral. But in many contexts, it is rude or it is predatory to leer at people who you're attracted to. The problem is that once you build in systems of inhibition, guilt, and shame that prevent you from leering at sexual objects in some contexts, it's difficult to release that inhibition in contexts where it is appropriate. I also think that a lot of gay women have a hostility to sexual gazing that comes from a fairly justified paranoia about voyeurism. Gay women are a sexual minority, and we have to constantly navigate a world where our sexuality is primarily viewed as a kind of fetish object in itself for consumption by men. For example, on Reddit, the forum r/lesbians is a pornography subreddit for men. Actual lesbians have to use other forums because there are more men who fetishize lesbians than there are lesbians in the world. Many gay women also have traumatic experiences with unicorn hunters on dating apps, women springing their boyfriends on them unexpectedly. A gay woman I know told me about an encounter she had where she went home with a woman that she met on a dating app and started to hook up, only to have her hookup's boyfriend literally come out of the closet mid-scene and attempt to join in. No consent, just like full sexual assault. So for a lot of gay women, there's, a kind of atmosphere of fear around being gazed at that's been inculcated by a series of traumatic experiences. It reminds me of something that Bell Hooks describes a Black female movie fan telling her about how she watches movies.
We are afraid to talk about ourselves as spectators because we have been so abused by the gays.
I think gay women are in a certain situation. Gay women have been abused by the gays, and so they're uncomfortable with it even when they themselves are the bearers of the look. And the result can be a kind of neo-Victorian hostility to visual stimulus. Consider the very different reactions among queer women to the two lesbian movies, Blue is the Warmest Color, which is regarded as a male-gazy piece of repellent pornography, and Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which is widely loved. Now, some of the problem is that a lot of, quote, lesbian movies are directed by men, and women can usually sense, if they don't know, that there's a male eye behind the camera, which in itself triggers the fear of voyeurism and is off-putting. Women often object to sapphic sex scenes that feel performative or unrealistic in certain ways. I don't take the unrealistic objection at face value because I don't think that anyone really wants sex scenes to be, quote, realistic. Isn't the point of creating art that we want fantasy, that we want a, in some ways, idealized situation? So when women complain that a lesbian sex scene is unrealistic, usually what they mean is that they can sense the male eye behind the camera. Unrealistic Dionysian shrieking, strange contortions of the body designed to maximize exhibitionism for the camera, obliviousness to the discomfort of being penetrated by someone with long nails. The result is that women can't buy into the fantasy and can't enjoy the spectacle on screen. They become oppositional spectators, conscientious objectors. And it's compounded by the fact that many gay women also have a kind of guilty or disavowing relationship to sexual gazing itself, which we saw in these Reddit posts about women who feel guilty even looking at their own partners in a sexual way. Gay women tend not to go in for shameless leering because they know what it's like to be abused by the gays. Being an object of the gays has, for most women, been a source of trauma, and also women tend to identify more with other women, which, as I've discussed, can be an obstacle to objectification. And again, I'll repeat the disclaimer that I am generalizing. Yes, there are lesbians who basically act like creepy men, but those women are the exception and not the rule. Another stereotype that I think has some basis in truth is the idea of lesbian bed death. The idea that same-sex female couples have a particular difficulty in maintaining sexual intimacy in long-term relationships. Obviously, this is a problem for everyone. It's not just gay women. Straight people have this problem, gay men have this problem. But I do feel like the problem has a certain flavor when it comes to gay women, and I think it has to do with the almost over-identification of women with each other in romantic couples. Desire requires distance, requires a gap to be overcome, and two women who intensely identify with each other will find that their ego boundaries begin to dissolve.
You and I have begun to blur.
It's a case of too much of a good thing. We all want to be seen and recognized, but I think that being so relentlessly humanized can actually be sexually inhibiting. Something about objectification is kind of hot. It enables you to access the kind of more intense, aggressive elements in human sexuality without the restraint of guilt. So we want to feel seen, but not too much. It's kind of like eye contact. You should make eye contact with someone during a conversation, but there's such a thing as too much eye contact. The reason a staring contest is uncomfortable is that you are looking at someone, looking at you, looking at them, looking at you, looking at them, and something about that recursive relationship of seeing and being seen it's a little bit uncomfortable. It makes you feel self-conscious all the time, and that self-consciousness is inhibiting and it keeps you from enacting sexual desire. There's an SNL sketch contrasting a parody reality show for gay men with a parody reality show for gay women.
If you think Fire Island is non-stop sex? Wait till you see what passes for a bang fest in Cherry Grove.
I just need you to tell me that you see me. I see you. I see you.
Here it is again. Men like bodies, women like emotions. I mean, I guess you have to concede that there is some truth to the stereotypes. Though to be fair, I think that middle-aged gay men probably act a lot more like lesbians. I don't know, this prejudice is something that I actually internally struggle with. I don't rationally endorse this, but I sort of feel in my bones that men desire more intensely. And I think to some extent I actually envy gay men for what I perceive as their enlarged sexual desire and enjoyment. That's kind of a me problem. It's probably an issue for therapy and not for YouTube content. But okay, to the extent that the stereotypes are true, why? Well, my theory is that it's largely because women have more anxiety and guilt around gazing, visual pleasure, and objectification. Part 8, the genderfluid gaze. If I had to nominate a type of media as the unadulterated expression of distinctly feminine sexuality, I would choose fanfiction / and male-male erotica. The female gaze in its purest form is not Magic Mike. It's Harry and Draco. Women producing and consuming male-male erotica is stigmatized as in itself some kind of a voyeuristic appropriation of gay men's sexuality, but I think that it provides women with a space to enjoy both erotic attraction and erotic identification, something that women don't often get anywhere else. So you get boys love manga, yaoi, John Locke. Female fans of this kind of erotica have discovered a type of sexual fantasy that they can enjoy without the guilt and anxiety of heterosexual power dynamics. There's a book about this by Lucy Neville called Girls Who Like Boys, Women and Gay Male Pornography and Erotica. I think I've mentioned this book before. I'm sure I'll mention it again. I think it's one of the most clear-headed studies of women's sexuality that I've ever read. The book examines a pretty exhaustive list of psychological reasons that attract women to male-male erotica, but the one that concerns me for the sake of this tangent is the idea that a lot of women find it helpful in sexual fantasizing to borrow a male gaze and to view men as if they were a gay man.
A large proportion of the women I spoke with often identify as male, if not in a day-to-day sense, certainly in a sexual sense.
What does it mean to sexually identify as a man? I feel like the phrase sexually identify is so stigmatized by the attack helicopter jokes, but let's take it seriously. What does it mean to sexually identify? Well, I think in this case it means that when you engage in sexual fantasizing, daydreaming, erotica writing, you self-insert in masculine form. You put your animus into the fantasy and you act as a man. And I find it very intuitive to understand. Neville surveys a few hundred women who are regular consumers of male-male erotica and finds that 5% of them identify as lesbians. Why would gay women want to consume erotica that only contains male characters? Well, one of the survey participants says, despite the fact that my significant other is female and we've been together for 30 years, femslash is of little interest in my fantasy life. Plus, my significant other and I relate to each other in our shared fantasies as male. I definitely have done this myself. In my gender presentation on YouTube, I often will kind of lean into this paradoxical presentation of a gay woman who is also somehow a gay man. In consuming media, I'm drawn to relationships like Hannibal and Will, Louis and Lestat. I think part of it has to do with the usual guilt trip. Attraction to women often makes me feel like a predator. And I feel that that's especially heightened because I'm a trans woman and there's all these tropes floating around in the discourse about how trans women are predators that exploit women, etc., etc. But I can kind of guiltlessly enjoy a predatory dynamic if it's between two men. Which is not to say I only identify as the predator. Part of the appeal is that you can kind of shift identification between predator and prey. Neville describes what's been called the genderfuck gaze. Quote, many perverse but enjoyable relations of looking. The imagined self has the freedom to mutate into alternative manifestations. A shifting gaze, one where they can watch male-male pornography from a number of perspectives. It reminds me of a quote from The Second Sex, where Beauvoir describes a dynamic where lesbians, when embracing each other, each one was both man and woman, and was enchanted with the other's androgynous virtues. Love that. This to me is the genderfluid gaze, the verse gaze. If you'll excuse my making a value judgment, clearly the superior gaze. Part 9. Beyond complaining. So what is wrong with the male gaze anyway? Why are feminists always complaining about this? Is anything wrong? What is it that we want? Well, to clarify this, I have made a list of demands. Demand 1. Men need to learn how to identify with women. Currently, men are not socialized to identify with women, and there are numerous social media influencers indoctrinating the next generation of men into never identifying with women for even 1 second. How do we solve this? Well, step 1 is to put Andrew Tate in a rocket and send him to the moon. Step 2 is something that men kind of have to choose to do for themselves on some level. Read books written by women. Read novels. Read feminist theorists of different dispositions. Follow women on social media and see what they say about things. You do not need to reply. You don't need to respond. Just read and think. I'm not saying you need to believe everything a woman says. No, of course not. A lot of women believe ridiculous things. I've spent a lot of this video arguing against things that women have said. But if you don't close yourself off from the feminine world in the way I feel like a lot of men do, you'll kind of get a better sense for the way that a lot of women sort of react to things and all the diversity of the ways that women feel about sexuality and about men and about gazing. And if enough men do this, I just feel like heterosexuality will work better. It will help men see women as people and not as like erotic projections of their own desire. Demand number 2. Women need to overcome their own social conditioning and learn how to desire more actively. Right? Women should not be so stifled by guilt and shame that they feel like sexual predators for looking at their own spouse's body. In order for this change to happen, society also probably needs to change. Women's sexual desires need to be shamed less, and honestly, male predatory behavior needs to be shamed more, so that the average woman doesn't come of age traumatized to the point of neurosis. Demand number 3, I'm sorry to say, but feminists probably need to stop talking as if the male gaze and sexual objectification are 1 generation away from total abolition. Sorry, this is my anti-utopian lecture that I have to give everyone at the end of every video. I just feel like some feminists are engaged in what to me seems like a somewhat comically futile quest to dictate that all male lusts and tastes should conform to female sensibilities. This is not an achievable goal. I think that men and women are always going to view the world somewhat differently. In particular, I think that men will probably always regard women with some ambivalent mixture of love and hate, of fear and awe and aggression and guilt. And this ambivalence will be revealed in the art that men make, and it will make women uncomfortable. And because there's power in visual representation, I think the differences between male and female gaze amount to a genuine conflict of interest. Probably there is an eternal gender war. There's some things in life that we're just kind of stuck with. Abolishing capitalism or whatever will not fix it. I think the best possible outcome is for this conflict to simply be balanced to the point of equilibrium. And that's something that's being accomplished simply by increasing the power of women in media. The storyteller always brings their own perspective to the story. So a media industry that's dominated by men will probably never be able to represent women in a way that's satisfying to women. And if you're a woman, you may find that women can't even represent women the way you want to be represented. And if that's the case, and you're unable to find an agreeable court-appointed attorney, you may just have to represent yourself.